Hello. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. So you know, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factually and logically consistent. So, today's show, Ultra, good to see that you're here. So you're here for it. I'm here for it too. So, as we know, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. So today we're going to be analyzing the SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action. We know that recently the Supreme Court of the United States gave a ruling on affirmative action. So basically ending race-based affirmative action for admission courses into universities, right? So what I want us to do with this is to take each justice's opinion on a particular day and just try to analyze it. So I've tried to go through that of Justice Roberts today. I'm just going to share my screen. I highlighted some points. This is going to be an open stream, so I'll put the link in the chat so anybody can call in. Let's just have a discussion, right, on specific points that were made in this opinion. So today we'll take Chief Justice Roberts. Tomorrow we'll take another justice till we exhaust it. I think I'm going to be doing this every day till we just exhaust it, because I want it to be as I want it to be as fair, balanced, and representative as possible. I don't want a situation where we're missing out on points, where our biases come in. In fact, it's been an eye-opener for me just reading through the I think I have a better understanding of what affirmative action was even supposed to achieve in the first place, right? So, but before that, just some little housekeeping. So, if you're coming here for the first time or so watching, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member. Just go to the page of this channel and there's a join button. You can also support on Patreon, and definitely you can get my crime fiction novel on Amazon. All those you can find in the description of this video. So let's get started. So let me just put the link so that you guys can start calling in. Then we will get the show running. So first of all, what is affirmative action? What necessitated? Why was there a need for affirmative action in the first place? So according to Investopedia, affirmative action refers to a policy aimed at increasing workplace and educational opportunities for people who are underrepresented in various areas of society. It focuses on demographics with historically low representation in leadership and professional roles. It is often considered a means of countering discrimination against particular groups. And I think that last point needs to be highlighted. That so one of the purposes of affirmative action is to counter discrimination against particular groups. Probably there's been historical discrimination against a particular group. So to bring them up to speed. So part of the reason was to, okay, let us do some race-based affirmative action to help shore up the numbers of those groups, right? So we also know that affirmative action was, I think it was in the 1960s that these affirmative action policies came into order. I think March 6, 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925, which included a provision that government contractors take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, or creed. Okay. The intent of this executive order was to affirm the government's commitment to equal opportunity for all qualified persons and to take positive action to strengthen efforts to realize true equal opportunity for all. Okay. While on September 24, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued Executive Order 11246 prohibiting employment discrimination based on race, sex, color, religion, and all that. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, you guys Americans, you know the history of affirmative action much more than I do. So Stanley, Colin, let's get this rolling. Let's get this started. Maybe we can just do some preamble before I share my screen, and then we'll start talking about um, Justice's opinion. Start talking about the opinion of Justice Roberts. So this has caused some sort of division, especially on Twitter. Twitter is always a fun place to have these kinds of conversations, where, funny enough, the eye has been mostly on there's such backlash and hatred for Clarence Thomas right now. It's almost as if he's the only justice on the Supreme Court. All the vitriol is towards that man, and I really don't get it. I mean, you may disagree with his opinion, but he's not the only one who had an opinion that was. Six justices had the same opinion or something similar to the same opinion, right? So why is he being the one that speaked out for this kind of why is it the one that speaks out for this kind of vitriol? I really don't understand why that is. So, as a background for uh, the rolling back or the ending of affirmative action was the Students for Fair Admissions, a body, think Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated. They were the one who started this court case because they started this court case against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, right? So claiming that Asian students were being discriminated against because of affirmative action policies. So I think this case has been on since 2022, and finally in June 29, 2023, the Supreme Court has reached its decision to roll back affirmative action. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take Stanley. Where are you? Coming. We're going to take Chief Justice Roberts' opinion on this and see where it takes us to. A lot of people have been saying, oh, this is going to set back race relations 1,000 years. Some people have been saying, oh, this is bad for African Americans. This is slavery. This is so many wonderful things on Twitter, right? But Twitter can be a very, very hyperbolic place, so it might not give a true representation of what exactly the impact of this thing is going to be. But hey, Stanley, welcome to the conversation. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Good, good. So overall, what are your sentiments? What are your feeling towards this decision? Just give me a summary of where you are currently at with this decision. Either Stanley? Okay, so I see Stanley is still
Hey,
trying to.
can Charles, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Uh, don't know why my camera's not working, but I think my first step in going, diving deeper is the one thing I agree with Thomas on, and many others, is it wasn't helping the people it was intended to help. It had just, post 1978, it basically didn't work. And, once you, once we go into Clarence Thomas's consent, I can follow up more on that. But it wasn't
All
working.
right.
It's not going to hurt to get rid of it. And my
Oh,
second
so
thing is, yes, um, but if you actually read Robert's majority opinion, um, it doesn't say uh, the word experience. He's not precluding race being something that can be a factor into getting into wherever it is you're trying to get into. So I'm okay with the decision. He's not saying, I'm not absolutely sure that affirmative action is struck down um, for several reasons, and we can get into that later.
Hmm. Okay, noted. So this, can you see the screen? Can you see what's on the screen? The Chief Justice
Yeah.
Roberts, the page. Okay, good. So Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated, petitioner versus University of North Carolina. So this is Chief Justice Roberts delivered the opinion of the court, and I'll just read some things, and then we'll try to analyze it. So in these cases, we consider whether the admission systems used by Harvard College and University of North Carolina, two of the oldest institutions of higher learning in the United States, are lawful under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So basically, this case, they are looking at it against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which, if I understand
Yes.
it correctly, says that nobody should be discriminated against based on sex, race, ethnicity, and so many other
No.
criteria. And okay,
No, it doesn't. The 14th Amendment does not mention protected classes. You're confusing the 14th Amendment with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. No, they're two different things.
okay. So what's the 14th Amendment about? Can you summarize it for me?
Um, there shall be no discrimination on the basis of race, basically. It doesn't mention sex, doesn't mention protected classes.
Oh, so it was specifically about race.
Yes.
Oh,
And the
get
whole
you.
reason for the 14th Amendment being was because of race.
Hmm.
Sex as a protected class came um, roughly 40 years later
Hmm.
with I think it was the 19th Amendment. So, no,
Hmm.
it's literally 14th Amendment is basically all people shall be treated correctly. But back then, men were the only voters. Women weren't even allowed to vote, or a lot of things women couldn't do. So
Hmm.
don't get the two confused. There were no protected classes invented with the 14th Amendment. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill based on the 14th Amendment, but not the 14th Amendment. And by the way, there's an 1866 Civil Rights. I'm sorry, I said 64 Amendment. It's 64 Civil Rights Bill, Act of Congress.
Hmm.
But the other thing I want to say is there was I think there was an 1866 and an 1875, both legislation based on the 14th Amendment. And Roberts doesn't bring it up, but Clarence Thomas does.
Okay. So I think we're going to be looking a little bit at the admission processes of Harvard itself. So, founded in 1636, Harvard College has one of the most selective application processes in the country. Over 60,000 people applied to the school last year. Fewer than 2,000 were admitted. So, it seems that this is a very competitive school. So, they have to have criteria for screening out people. And there might be a lot of qualified people, but by the end of the day, they have to be able to, they can't obviously take everybody. So, there has to be certain criteria to be able to screen out people. The admissions process at Harvard works as follows. Every
Yeah,
application is
hold
initially,
hold on before you scroll ahead.
okay.
Um, those categories, um, is race one of the categories?
So we're going to get there. we're going to get there. So let me just read.
Well,
So the
no,
admission process.
the admissions process at Harvard, there's nothing in those six criteria that mentions race.
Let me read the six criteria. The six criteria. So the admissions process at Harvard works as follows. Every application is initially screened by a first reader who assigns scores in six categories. So the first is academic, the second is extracurricular, the third is athletic, the fourth is school support, the fifth is personal, and the seventh overall. A rating of 1 is the best. A rating of 6 the worst. In the academic category, for example, a 1 signifies near perfect standardized test scores and grades. In the extracurricular category, it indicates truly unusual achievement. And in the personal category, it donates outstanding attributes like maturity, integrity, leadership, kindness, and courage. A score of 1 on the overall rating, a composite of the 5 other ratings, signifies an exceptional candidate with greater than 90% chance of admission. In assigning the overall rating, the first readers can and do take on applicants' race into account. So even though it is not explicitly stated that race is one of the categories, right? So in one of those categories, race is usually taken into consideration. But my question is, how often or to what extent is race taken into consideration in that category itself, since there are other elements that also play in that category?
Don't know. Um, and um, I have huge problems. Not actually, I think Robert's writing for the majority isn't the worst decision. I can kind of live with how he has written. And, Thomas is actually hugely problematic. But the thing is, and this is the crux of the majority opinion. Your question, how much does race play into it? That exactly is why it was struck down. Grutter uh, uh, requires strict scrutiny, which is basically you have to be able to measure how much race is involved. That's really the crux of why it got struck down. Judicial, it doesn't stand up to judicial review. They want to be able to go, well, 60%, or
Mm,
they want to quantify it. So your question is great. We don't know was why it was struck down.
mm.
It can't be quantified, both in the Harvard case and the UNC case. The court can't quantify it.
So I, I have a problem with even these categories themselves. So for academic,
Really?
I'm very fine with academic criteria, right? I think that should be the most, if at all, the only criteria. I don't know, but I think that should be the only criteria because the others are just so nebulous.
Okay.
I mean,
Well,
what do you?
just as an aside, don't mean to interrupt. I thoroughly disagree with that.
Okay.
Making all A's doesn't mean you're the best candidate.
Yeah, but it's much more objective than when you say extracurricular. How do you measure extracurricular? How do you measure school
It's
support?
something
How
we
do you measure personal?
it's something we can talk about later. And I have the benefit of age. I've seen dudes who were like PhDs couldn't lead people. So academics are not the. It is a measure. It is a measure you should pay attention to. But if you're just basing everything on test scores and academics purely, um, you're probably gonna have about 50% success rate in real life.
So my issue
Harvard
with this is,
Harvard is not real. Harvard is not real life. College is not real life.
yeah, yeah, of course it's not real life, but I like, with things like this, I like things that are quantifiable, things that are measurable. There's just too much room for subjectivity in how, okay, let's look at say for example, one signifies near perfect. In the extracurricular category, it indicates truly unusual achievement. What what do you mean by truly unusual achievement? What's the metric for
I'm
saying
sorry,
someone
say
has a
that again.
truly okay? So in the category of extracurricular,
Mhm.
it's expanded to say that this category indicates when someone has a one in that category, means the person has truly unusual achievement. Then in the personal category, it denotes outstanding attributes like maturity, integrity, leadership, kindness, and courage. I'm just trying to understand how they can determine this for thousands of applicants. By what objective metric they're able
Well,
to
I
sift
mean,
out who is more mature,
it's
uh, has
essentially
integrity, leadership, and all that.
someone
It's
someone stands. Well, no, I'm trying to quantify. Um, if a person has like a 3.6 average, like mostly A's but not all A's. However, the dude has been, you know, to like a White House intern, or you know sometimes, or dude was like a I had a friend of mine when I was in eighth and in a couple years in high school. He didn't have all A's, but he was an excellent basketball player. You know, he basketball was important, being a good athlete was important. He didn't have a 4.0, but dude could dunk a basketball in 8th grade, and
and
he
send him to a school
maintained.
where this is not a
He went
sports
to
school.
Cornell. He got an
Yes,
athletic
yes.
scholarship to Cornell. He could maintain. Cornell's an Ivy League school.
Yeah. So my point,
So if he had
which
not played basketball and gotten a 4.0, fine. But he was outstanding. He could do more than he could make some A's in some classes and be a
no, you're
benefit to an
mixing
athletic
you're
team.
mixing
That
categories. You're mixing
is
categories.
someone who can do.
Stanley, you're mixing categories. Okay. So
I'm
for
sorry.
athletic, yeah, you were mixing categories. Let's say
Okay,
for
one of the
athletic.
categories is athletics.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't talking about athletic.
Right.
I think
So
even in
you have to
athletics,
do more than
this
one thing.
for athletics, it's possible to even get a better objective measure of athletics.
Okay,
But
Charles,
for things like
Charles,
personal,
Charles.
for things like
To know a
extracurricular,
child
for things like school support,
who
and the
happens
fact that these
to
things
who
and the fact that these
happens
things
to
have equal weighting as
volunteer.
academic.
Personal, let me define.
Okay.
One of the words in there is kindness. What if a kid spends a lot of time with the old and infirm? He's gotten awards for it, recognized for it. People at his high school will write him recommendation letters. A couple B's, but he has been taking care of the old and infirm and been there for people um, who needed him, came to like him, etc. That's the personal. No one told him to do it. to do it. He's not going to get a grade for taking care of the sick and infirm. Darn, he didn't get a 4.0, but he was a social good. He made a personal decision to go and help people who were sick and who were infirm.
Okay, I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense. But I just don't think that these
Um,
things should have
and
equal
let me make
weightage.
one quick aside. Harvard, Harvard, and places like Harvard want Renaissance people. They don't want someone who is obsessed with grades and SATs.
Hmm.
Same thing with the American military and the Navy. We don't want someone who can necessarily, ace or has a photographic memory. We want people who can do more than one thing sometimes at the same time, multitask.
Okay, all right. So going on, they said once the first read process is complete, Harvard convenes admission subcommittees. Each subcommittee meets for 3 to 5 days and evaluates all applicants from a particular geographic area. The subcommittees are responsible for making recommendations to the full admissions committee. The subcommittees can and do take an applicant's race into account when making their recommendations. So this is also still very nebulous. How do they do that? How do they take the race into account? Still not, still doesn't tell me how important race is in the admission process. And this might just be
Right.
giving an
And
over
justice.
it might be giving an overinflated it might be giving an overinflated perception of the importance of race in these admissions. It may just be that the African Americans that got into Harvard, they got in there by other criteria, other stronger criteria than race itself,
Yes.
and then they're just looked at
Yeah.
as oh, you only got here because of
Yes.
your race, when race could very easily have been the littlest factor that played into why they got there.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It wasn't just race, which was Harvard's argument. Um, and it's a very complicated thing. America's a complicated country, but essentially what they're saying is that um, they don't want they don't want to succumb to a system where you apply to Harvard and there are two criteria: grades and SATs.
Mm.
And I talked to someone last night, and I have to ask you, Charles, are you saying that grades and SATs should be the only two criteria? Because those can be measured, which is the crux of Robert's majority opinion.
Yeah, yeah, because they are objective, they can be measured. So for me, it takes out any doubt as to whether this person is supposed to be here in the first place. But when you have other criteria that can be very, very subjective, it's messy in my mind.
No, it can't
It's
be.
just messy.
Can't be subjective. You grades and SATs, those are measurable, which was John Roberts' problem with
Yeah,
how Harvard and UNC were doing things. They're measurable. My ultimate question is, if you just go by those two criteria and you come up with a metric to rank people, and then, there are going to be a ton of people. Your graduating class is a specific amount. We just go by those two criteria and pick the top, I don't know, I can't remember the number, like 500 or whatever the number is. Is that how it should be done?
something approximate to that. I think
And
those
you know
two.
what?
I think those two should have a bigger weight than I just don't. I'm not comfortable with the idea that they have equal weight, as in the academic part of it has equal weight with something as personal, something as something as the other criteria that are there. Overall, it just seems skewed to me. It's skewed in favor of factors that are not easily measurable. Like we're discussing how much does race even factor into this thing. The reason we're having that discussion is now
Okay.
because there is no
Well,
there is no
I'll
figure.
just
There's
kind of
nothing
stop
attached to
here
it.
or anything like that. If you're only going to look at um, IQ scores, essentially, is what people like Charles Murray have equated uh, SAT scores to, plus grades. If those are the two criteria, and you're not alone, um, the the uh, the Asian argument is essentially that it should be strictly merit based and nothing else. And there's a trap in my logic here, and you probably already know what it is, but I simply cannot um, embrace um, numbers as a human worth. The third criteria would be how rich you are. That's numbers too.
Yeah, but that's a number that we can reject. That's not a number that has anything to do with the capacity of the person. That's a number that's external to the person's capacity. So
Well,
let's
I've
continue.
lost my argument. In your opinion, if grades and SAT scores are the standard, then you are right. I can't defend it. At least we know what the merit, you know, of your argument is. It's going to be horribly objective and robotic would be, the way
Yeah, but
I just.
non-contentious. So at the beginning of the meeting, the committee discusses the relative breakdown of applicants by race. The goal, according to Harvard's Director of Admissions, is to make sure that Harvard does not have a dramatic drop-off in minority admissions from the prior class. So basically, they are juggling the um, the race percentage of the individuals in the class in the admission process. So I think mostly when every other thing has been considered, right? Maybe race is used as a tiebreaker or something. In my mind, that's what I'm thinking. Because if they are trying
Uh,
to make sure that they don't hit below a certain number. Maybe the last year's
right.
African Americans were 12%. This year they don't want to hit less than 12%. So what happens if
It's
um
the,
the
I think Roberts actually is right there. That's de facto quotas. You can't, if you're not doing like managing the ratios of, one group or another. That's de facto ratios. And that was outlawed um, in 1978 with the Bakke case. He's right
Mhm.
there.
Yeah, and I think so too. Each applicant considered by the full committee is discussed one by one, and every member of the committee must vote on admission. Only when an applicant secures a majority of the full committee's votes is he or she tentatively accepted for admission. At the end of the full committee meeting, the racial composition of the pool of tentatively admitted students is disclosed to the committee. The final stage of Harvard's process is called the LOP, during which the list of tentatively admitted students is winnowed further to arrive at the final class. Any applicants that Harvard considers cutting at this stage are placed on the LOP list, which contains only four pieces of information: legacy status, recruited athlete status, financial aid eligibility, and race. So I think after a whole lot of selection process, maybe to now fine tune it, they now use these criteria again: legacy status, recruited athlete status, financial eligibility, and race.
I'm sorry. Repeat your last sentence.
Okay, so I said I'm thinking that
Or were
after
you
the
quoting?
okay, and any applicant that Harvard considers cutting at this stage are placed on a lock. That's when they've done a whole lot of sorting, which contains only four pieces of information. So those who are placed on the lock are now selected based on these four criteria, which is legacy status, recruited athlete status, financial aid eligibility, and race. So this is where race now stands out as a standalone factor for determining whether someone gets in or not.
Essentially, that's just saying you can't do it that way. And there are less problems with Robert's majority opinion approach
Hmm.
than Clarence Thomas's.
Yeah. So
Um,
Robert said something here very, very pointed. He said in the Harvard admissions process, quote, race is a
essentially,
determinative tip
race is
for
a determinative. Disagree with what Harvard
for
is doing.
let me finish
I,
reading this point.
I don't think race is that hard a criteria, but
Let me
the
finish reading this
Supreme
point,
Court has
Stanley.
ruled. I don't agree with Robert's opinion.
Stanley. In the Harvard admissions process, race is a determinative tip for a significant percentage of all admitted African American and Hispanic
But
applicants.
that,
I'm very,
right,
very,
but
I'm very, very concerned. I'm very, very interested in knowing what
okay,
this
let me
significant
ask you a
percentage
question though.
means.
It's not in quotes, it's Robert's interpretation.
I
Harvard
know
didn't
it's his
say that.
interpretation.
Charles,
Of course,
I literally listened to the oral argument. Nowhere did UNC or Harvard say race was a determinative factor.
you're not
They
listening to me,
always
Stanley.
argued.
You're not
I'm
listening to me.
saying,
I read I read
okay,
this and I'm saying I'm interested in
and
what
I'm
Robert
saying
means
it's a
by a
misquote.
significant percentage. I'm trying to understand what Roberts mean by a significant percentage. Is it saying that most of
I'm
the black students' race is the tipping factor for them? If their race wasn't considered, they most likely would not be in the law. Is that what he's saying? That's what I'm trying to understand.
I'm saying that Roberts is being dishonest here.
Well, probably. I don't know.
It is a clip out of context. I listened to the arguments. Literally, there's a Supreme Court like oral arguments are being presented. You can listen to it live. And nowhere did UNC or Harvard say that race was a determining factor. They did say it was one of the factors. They were honest there. I think I'm sorry,
But
he's
you Stanley,
misquoting
you're missing.
and out of context.
No, Stanley. He wasn't quoting. He was giving his interpretation. Right? One. Number two, he didn't say it is the only fact. He said it's a tipping factor. So if every other thing is was equal, if for example you had 10 people who were just as qualified as each
You're
other,
breaking up a bit.
right? So I was saying he didn't say race was the only factor, right? He said it's a tipping factor, which means that if you have 10 people that are just as qualified as each other, and you have to choose, say, 7 from them, then maybe the race of the African American or the Hispanic um, boosted their chances rather than the other people of the other races. So that's what I believe he was trying to say. But the where I take issues with it, I need to understand what he means by significant percentage. That for a significant percentage of African Americans and Hispanics, that race was a tipping factor. Probably if he had stated a number, that would have given me a better idea of understanding what he was trying to drive with that point. Well, okay, going for further, this place was very interesting to me when I read it, right? Justice Jackson attempts to minimize the role that race plays in UNC's admissions process by noting that from 2016 to 2021, the school accepted a quote lower percentage of the most academically excellent in-state black candidates. That is 65 out of
Hey
67.
Charles, let
Such
me let me hop on my phone because you're breaking up a bit.
okay. Let me ask, guys, can you hear? Please let me know if you can hear me. Okay. Going back to the part where I was reading, where it says Justice Jackson attempts to minimize the role that race plays in UNC's admission process by noting that from 2016 to 2021, the school accepted a lower percentage of the most academically excellent in-state black candidates. That is 65 out of 67 such applicants, representing 97%,
Hey
than
Charles, can
it
you
did.
hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, give me one
Can you hear me?
here. There's an echo. Yeah,
Okay, good. So
but give me one
there,
sec
I
because I
think,
think okay, we should be good now.
all right. There are two Stanleys, so which one am I removing? Okay,
The you
thanks.
if there's a YouTube or a computer, the one with the naval uniform, that's the one you should keep.
Oh, the one with the cap. The one with the cap on.
Yeah,
That's the one
and
I'm keeping.
I'm sorry about that. We're kind of having a storm here,
Okay.
so I had to
Okay, so
hop on the
there's a
phone.
very interesting point. There's a very interesting point that Justice Jackson is making here. So Justice Jackson attempts to minimize the role that race plays in UNC's admission process by noting that from 2016 to 2021, the school accepted a lower percentage of the most academically excellent in-state black candidates. That is
Mhm.
65 out of 67 such applicants, representing
Right.
97%, than it did similarly situated Asian applicants. That is 1,118 out of 1,139 such applicants. That is 98.16%. Now you
Well, let
know
me
what I
ask you a
see with something
question.
like
This
this.
is in this is in we haven't gotten to Jackson yet.
No,
Is
but I think
Roberts
Justice
quoting Jackson?
yes, I think he's responding to Jackson's something Jackson said. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm not going to comment, so please continue.
Okay. So he further said it is not clear how the rejection of just 2 black applicants over 5 years could be indicative of a genuinely holistic admission process as Justice Jackson contends. So to me, I see two things happening here. I see this at times is the problem with statistics, right? If you want to look at it on a purely statistical basis, you would say that, oh, the blacks were probably being discriminated against because there's a higher percentage of Asians who were admitted than blacks. But when you take into consideration
No.
the total numbers, no, let me finish my point. If you take
Okay.
into consideration absolute numbers, you see that the Asians, their numbers was so high, about over 1,000, while the total black numbers was just 67.
Well,
And
you kind
65 out of 67
of
was giving you 97%. While for the Asians, with thousands of students being admitted, you still had it at 98%. So maybe the problem with this, with the way the affirmative action is being looked at, is maybe we're looking at it too much from an analytical, statistical point of view. Because by the end of the
I
day, I think more Asians are still admitted than blacks are. But in percentage wise,
absolutely twice,
it might,
tw- uh, twice as many, and
yeah,
you
but in
are
percentage wise, it might
actually
seem,
you're hitting a major point.
yeah. So, but in percentage wise, it might seem as if more blacks are being admitted than Asians. And that just
Um,
messes up
per
things.
capita,
Yeah, per capita. But that's because the pool of
and see,
black
to
students,
me, that's not
the
much
pool
of
of
an
black students is
argument.
low. The pool of black students is low to begin with.
Okay, but let me, in Charles, I'm not even because I think your points. It's something that will have to be like after all the decisions, or I'm sorry, the concurrences or dissents are reviewed, because I think you're hitting a very major point. Fewer black people apply to Harvard in the first place.
Yep.
So I don't see it, they are arguing percentages versus raw numbers, and that's fine. That is statistics or the way America goes. I think statistics without context, which is what you're touching on,
Mm,
that's going to be America's downfall.
yeah. So when I
We
was
don't
reading
we
this,
don't do history, we don't do context. We do raw data. And I think that is such a horrible thing.
yeah,
So
so I think there can be pitfalls with raw data, as we have seen in this case now. Although they are the most objective criteria, but I think they can be pitfalls.
yeah,
So
but well, I'm not going to fuss. I
yeah,
don't
I think
think there are some
uh,
pitfalls to purely objective ways
yes,
of
yes,
viewing real life.
yes. I knew I was just going to say that it's as if I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. I'm trying to understand the arguments. I'm trying to weigh the benefits of. I'm just trying to put everything in context and take each point as it comes. So yes,
Can't fuss at you.
I still think that objective metrics are the best way of determining who should get into the schools, even though they shouldn't be the only metric. But I think they should be given greater weight than things that are subjective or contextual.
But can I
But on the
make
other hand,
a very crude metaphor, which
yep.
you and anyone listening to this are just gonna, really drub me on. Killing people is bad,
Mm-hmm,
objectively.
mm-hmm,
It depends on why you are killing someone that in the end matters.
mm-hmm,
And I can't, it's horribly crude, but my point is context. And I just don't think, and I think Roberts was reasonable. I think I have some problems, some quibbles, but overall, I just don't find the majority opinion objectionable. It, I have quibbles.
mm.
So,
Okay. Yeah.
and
So
it wasn't working. Affirmative action after 1978 wasn't working anyway. Let's scrap it. I just don't have a problem with that.
mm, according to SFFA's experts, over 80% of all Black applicants in the top academic decile were admitted to UNC, while under 70% of white and Asian applicants in that decile were admitted. So this might
Okay,
also
what
be
does
as a
that
result.
mean though?
So this might also be as a result of the pool. Probably the
Okay,
pool of Black students was very low,
but let
and the
me
pool of
ask you a question. And
mm,
maybe I'm just naive, but far fewer people apply to UNC. Black people, black kids
mm,
apply. So if five people like apply and four of them get accepted compared to, thousand other people, and then, you can parse out race if need be.
mm,
That means four of the four of the five got accepted. How is
mm,
that? And I'm assuming that these black kids, the five, were acceptable. And
yeah,
if you look at the larger number of the number of kids getting into a class, so four or whatever the number is got accepted, they were competitive. How is that racism? That's what
mm,
confuses me.
mm,
Now,
yeah,
if you're managing like you only have to have five, or you only have to have X number of any demographic, that is basically against the Baki decision. You can't have quotas. I agree with that.
yeah. So, like I said earlier, I think we are running into a problem with numbers to begin with. The number of applicants from either
Well,
of from these groups to begin with. There's a
agree.
huge disparity in the number of applicants from each of these racial groups, such that
But I,
no
I
matter
want
what
to
happens,
insert something here. The
mm,
problem with numbers is people don't understand how numbers work.
mm,
If 80% of five black kids get accepted, how is that a huge problem? The number is
mm,
80%
mm,
extracted from the total number of kids getting in compared to another group of kids separated out by race. And there is an argument that, oh, well, that three of the four or five black kids shouldn't have been there compared to another extracted number of Asian kids, but they're three kids. Are you really gonna win? Should you be that concerned?
mm. Well,
Again, I
Antonio,
don't agree with quotas.
so Antonio Fernandez said he'd like to hear the numbers when it comes to percentages of racists who drop out or get failing grades. Maybe we'll see something regarding that later on
Oh,
as
that's a good,
we read on.
that's a great point.
Yeah, it's a great point. So at least that will give
But
us
let
an
me let
indication.
me let me ask, the people who drop out or change majors, but how, I'd like him to explain why that matters.
Well, it might matter in the sense that if if a huge amount of a certain demographic is they're dropping out, then you begin to question yourself, were they supposed to be there in the first place? What's going on
But
with so 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 much of, and those spots could have been taken by people who would not have dropped out if
no,
they had been considered.
but I don't know. Maybe I understand numbers differently. But how many white kids drop out because they were overmatched academically? How many Asian kids get overmatched and drop out? I haven't heard those percentages.
Yeah, the percentages, they're not just for, if at all, they're not just for African Americans. The percentages will be there for all groups as well, I think. So,
Right. But the thing is those numbers never came up.
well,
If the argument that I've heard over the last couple of days is, I have never seen a black kid. Uh, and black kids always wind up in the cellar, the bottom 25%. But here's where my context argument comes in. We're talking the bottom 25% of a Harvard class.
mm,
Um, okay, what are the number of Asian kids who bomb out or white kids who bomb out? I don't ever hear those numbers. And I suspect I could be wrong. I could be defeated in my argument, but why are those comparisons not made? We hear about the number of black kids admitted. Where's the comparison of the numbers who fail out or change majors or just can't cut it? Where are those numbers?
I don't know.
But see, I think this, I'll stop here. I'm
Okay.
talking too much, but people don't understand numbers, is my problem. Where are the relevant numbers in Robert's decision?
So, continuing with the same thing, said in the second highest academic decile, the disparity is even starker. 83% of black applicants were admitted, while 58% of white applicants and 47% of Asian applicants were admitted. And in the third highest decile, 77% of black applicants were admitted compared to 48% of white applicants and 34% of Asian applicants. So to me, what I'm seeing here is that, okay, so the first three deciles, these are actually very high performing students, which means that it's not like they're dummies, right? So three out the first three decile out of 10, they're high performing students. And going
Mhm.
back to the fact that the absolute numbers for blacks were going to be are low to begin with, it only stands to reason to an extent that their admission numbers percentage wise would be higher because they come in from a very small pool.
That's exactly my point.
Wow. So I'm struggling to actually see the problem here anyway. I'm
Dude,
struggling to see the
all I'm saying is, um, so few black students even apply. And it may be nothing, but that's my point. I don't, and I have a whole nother argument, a meta argument, but you're kind of getting where I'm coming from. So I'm not
mm,
gonna, over talk. The numbers, if you actually understand numbers and their significance, I just don't see the problem.
yeah. Okay.
However, I will reemphasize Robert's argument of Roberts expressing the majority opinion.
Mm,
It does appear that Harvard specifically, they are managing their uh, percentages of 10% up to
mm,
12%.
mm.
The highest Hispanic population of freshmen were 12%. I have a problem with that.
Yeah,
You don't manage your populations.
yeah. So I think that's where they are. I think that's the the biggest argument against what Harvard is doing. That's
But
trying to
see, I
manage to
don't
make
I
sure.
don't disagree with that. I think Roberts is right.
Yeah. Okay, so the other highlighted point here is in November 2014, SFA filed separate lawsuits against Harvard College and University of North Carolina, arguing that their race-based admissions programs violated respectively Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. I think this was all we're talking about earlier. So do you want to throw
Mm.
more light on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the Fourth Amendment, how it relates to affirmative action?
Not sure I understand the question, and not sure. Um, I'm not sure I can answer that question cogently.
Okay. Okay, but
But
you do understand the Equal
I
Protection Clause.
also think that the Civil Rights Act really has nothing to do with this decision. They
Mm,
they cited even Justice Thomas
mm.
doesn't cite 1964 civil rights much.
But here, so Title 4 provides that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So,
Hmm.
this isn't this what Harvard was doing by
No.
using race as a factor? Weren't they excluding
Well.
certain?
A factor, yes, and that argument is valid. They were using
Mm,
race as a valid criteria. However, if you go back to Grutter, which was the University of Michigan case,
mm,
diversity was their reason, and you have to go back to compelling interest. So it's a little bit more complicated. Um, you can use race as long as it's justifiable and it has an end date. If you go back and read Robert's
yeah, I
decision,
think
it's right in
yes,
there.
it's still here. Yeah, we're going to get to that point. I think I saw that when I was reading earlier. We're going to get to that point. Okay. Article 3 of the Constitution limits the judicial
Whoa,
power
whoa,
of the
whoa.
United States.
Article 3 of the Constitution or the 14th Amendment?
No, I think we're talking the Constitution now.
Okay,
It
hold on one
limits the
second.
judicial power of the United States to cases or controversies, ensuring that federal courts act only as a necessity in the determination of real, earnest, and vital disputes.
Yes.
Okay? To state a case or controversy under Article 3, a plaintiff must establish standing Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization versus Wayne 523, blah, 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 that in turn requires a plaintiff to demonstrate that one, it has suffered an injury in fact, two, that is fairly traceable to the challenged conduct of the defendant, three, that it is likely to be redressed by a favorable judicial decision. So, do you think that this case brought by Student for Fair Admissions, do you think it meets these three criteria for it to be considered
I
by
think the
the Supreme
major
Court?
part was their argument about, and Justice Thomas brings this up a lot. I think Roberts brings it up a bit, but essentially they're saying it's a zero sum game. Admission at Harvard is a zero sum game. So, and they're right about that, but I just don't agree that some, I don't know. I'm not going to go into, because it would just be too complicated, my thinking. But yes, it's a zero sum game. if a black person that doesn't have the same academic qualifications as an Asian or any other group, by the way, if they
mm,
get in and someone with better qualifications gets in, then it is zero sum. That black kid took a position away from a kid with better qualifications. But here's the rub, there are more. There's six qualifications.
mm,
And some, it's a balance. That's why they give each category a specific number.
yeah.
In the end, you add them up. And once you total the number up, it doesn't matter which category you were deficient in.
Mm,
Overall,
overall.
you had a higher score. And this is where, academics is one of them, race is one of them. And I'm so overall score, and that's why I don't necessarily agree, but Roberts is right. There were several issues in how Harvard and UNC were doing these. So, you know, I don't agree with one part, but there are a couple other parts that are problematic. I can live with Roberts' way of viewing things,
Mm,
but if you step, higher into a meta point, um, I don't agree, but I can live with Robert's majority opinion. I can live with that.
okay. So I think they also,
Clarence Thomas's um, uh, consent is much more problematic.
okay, till we get to Clarence Thomas, till the day we get to him. So I think they also analyzed, Roberts also analyzed the Brown court case, and he said the conclusion reached by the Brown court was thus unmistakably clear. The right to a public education must be made available to all on equal terms, as the plaintiffs had argued. So no state has any authority under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to use race as a factor in affording educational opportunities among its citizens. So this is sort of just reinforcing Robert's
Mm,
argument that using race at all, just considering race at
I,
all, is against the 14th Amendment.
no, I that is a part that I just totally disagree. It goes back to the point of equal opportunity. Before you ever get to apply to Harvard, we have to look at things like economics. We have to look at the quality of public education. Um, this is another thing that Roberts et al. Totally skip over. Before
Mm,
you ever apply to Harvard, how you get to apply to Harvard or think you should apply to Harvard, that is actually the real problem. All
mm,
public schools in America are not equal. Education across public and private schools are not equal.
mm. So even that itself,
Well, hold on one second. My argument is equal opportunity does not exist before you
true,
apply to Harvard.
true, true. Okay. So eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it, and the Equal Protection Clause we have accordingly held applies without regard to any differences of race or color or nationality. It is universal in its application. So this will be an interesting point. Say, any exception to the Constitution's demands for equal protection must survive a daunting two-step examination, known in our cases as strict
Strict
scrutiny.
scrutiny, yeah.
Yeah. Under that standard, we ask first whether the racial classification is used to further compelling governmental interests. That's Grother versus Bollinger. Second, if so, we ask whether the government's use of race is narrowly tailored, meaning necessary to achieve that interest. Hmm. Outside the circumstances of these cases, our precedents have identified only two compelling interests that permit resort to race-based government action. One is remediating specific identified instances of past discrimination that violated the Constitution or statute.
Mm-hmm.
The second is avoiding imminent and serious risks to human safety in prisons, such as a race riot. I'm just going to ignore the second point. But the first point is
Right,
very
it's
interesting.
irrelevant.
Yeah, the first point is interesting in the sense that one of the cases in which race can be considered in such this thing is when it is used in remediating specific identified instances of past discrimination that
Mm-hmm.
violated the Constitution or statute. And we know from history that there was such a thing. I mean, slavery
Mm-hmm.
and Jim Crow and all that. So
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, someone can argue that then race-based affirmative action does not contravene the 14th Amendment, since there is a there is an exception for the use of it based on this thing that we just read here, this clause that we just read here.
Well, essentially, they're saying, or Roberts, speaking for the majority, is saying, um, kids to kids today are like decades. They're not affected by Jim Crow. They're not affected by slavery, and that's a
Okay.
very Clarence Thomas argument in
Mm.
many people. That is, and it's a valid argument, but I'm going to go back to my CRT and Derek Bell. Um, if you drop a pebble in the water, there are many ripples. And my argument is that my parents are rather, excuse me, rather old, but they lived under Jim Crow. I was born in '65, technically in Georgia. Um, I was born the year Jim Crow was made illegal. I don't buy that argument. I don't
So
think. Essentially, what they're saying is that a kid born in 1995 was not affected by Jim Crow or slavery or any of that stuff. And I would argue that if a school in the inner city paid for by property taxes is not as good as a school in Oakton, Virginia, if there's a disparity in elementary, public education first through 12, depending on where you live and the way segregation works, um, the inner city tends to be one race and Oakton, Virginia tends to be another race. That's de facto discrimination. One school is better than the other. There's not equal opportunity.
yeah, but one school being better than the other, how can you trace it to specific um, instances of discrimination? How do you
Dude, one
tie it?
school, one school who tends to be mostly black in an inner city, the kids are not as prepared as somewhere like Oakton, Virginia, which is mega rich. The
I'm
schools
still
have
struggling. I'm
more,
struggling to
the
find how that is
schools,
discrimination.
the schools have more money to spend on schooling.
They have more money to
The
spend on
kids,
schooling.
the kids in Yamacraw, in Savannah, Georgia, are not as well educated or as well prepared as the kids in Oakton, Virginia. That is literally not equal opportunity.
Yeah, I'm not talking about equal opportunity now because I agree that there is no such thing as equal opportunity to
Well,
begin
we
with.
can't do equality of outcome.
Well, of course, I still don't agree with equality of outcome, by the way. The thing is, how do you, just the fact that I know this is an overused, it's a cliche now, but I'm just going to use it. Discrimination does not mean this, disparity does not mean discrimination. I'm trying to understand how the disparity you are
Oh,
explaining now
okay.
is the result of discrimination.
Well, let's do, kind of like Anand's favorite thing, because statistics tend to be trends. People in Black communities in the United States tend statistically to be less wealthy than white communities. Can we agree on that?
Yep. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, we
Well,
can agree on that.
in that case, if property taxes are based on wealth of a community, property taxes, can you agree with that?
Hmm.
So if Oakton, Virginia, and I have a friend who grew up in Oakton, uh, so I'm picking on him. If these dudes are collecting more property taxes and more money means better schools, and that's how public schooling works in the US, versus Yamacraw. Um, I didn't grow up in Yamacraw, but I'm familiar. And they are pretty much way less wealthy. So there's less property taxes, but there are public schools there. The schools are not equal.
Yeah, it's not equal.
One
We know.
school can buy better
I'm
books and
saying
afford
I'm
better
saying
teachers.
discrimination. You need to prove discrimination. You need to
It's
prove that one school is
well,
was deliberately
so you
advantaged
don't.
over the other.
Oh, so you don't think that? And I'm going to throw this in there, and you're just going to have to disagree because I know you will. Historically, Yamacraw in Savannah, Georgia, is historically poor because it has always been black, versus Oakton, Virginia, which is in Fairfax County, one of the richest counties in the nation. So if you don't see that there's discrimination over American history, then I guess you're right and I'm wrong.
So we just
You
have to
don't
agree to
make them,
disagree on that.
you do not make them equal because all of a sudden black people are equal to white people. The wealth has been there for centuries.
So I think Antonio is making a very important point. He said, if there's any way to select based on hardships, like growing up in low income slash property value rather than race, I assume not, but it'd be nice. What do you think about that comment?
I think he's right. And I think Roberts left the experience point. I'm not opposed to, and there's going to be a part B to this point. I'm not opposed to that.
Mm.
Essentially, I think what Antonio was saying is, let's not look at color. I think Roberts makes that point. Let's not look at color. Let's look at class. And, progressives make that same argument. I'm not opposed to that because it
Mm.
it may kill two birds, kill figuratively. Two birds with one stone. I'm not opposed to that, but where's the
Mm.
commitment to making that change? I don't see it
Yeah.
from the Supreme Court. I don't see it in Congress. I don't see it in America.
Hmm. Okay. So, so it still said the court stressed the fundamental principle that there are serious problems of justice connected with the idea of racial preference itself. It observed that all racial classifications, however compelling their goals, were dangerous, and it cautioned that all race-based governmental action should remain subject to continuing oversight to assure that it will work the least harm possible to other innocent persons competing for the benefits. Mm. To manage these concerns, Grota imposed one final limit on race-based admissions programs. At some point, the court held they must end. So I think this is where they put the sort of statute of limitation. This requirement was critical, and Grota emphasized it repeatedly. All race-conscious admissions programs must have a termination point. They must have reasonable durational limits. They must be limited in time, must have sunset provisions, they must have a logical endpoint. Their deviation from the norm of equal treatment must be a temporary matter. The importance of an endpoint was not just a matter of repetition, it was the reason the court was willing to dispense temporarily with the Constitution's unambiguous guarantee of equal protection. The court recognized as much, enshrining a permanent justification for racial preferences. The court explained would offend this fundamental equal protection principle. So, so I think what it's saying is that part of the reason why such concessions were even given to race-based affirmative action things in the first place was because there had to be an agreement that it must end at a particular it must end, it must have a definite end point.
Yeah,
Maybe,
that's one of the three criteria for
yeah.
strict
So, but
scrutiny.
what's the criteria for determining the end point,
You're
determining the
not going to like
timeline?
my answer, and I'm just going to be kind of I'm going to burn my welcome. Um, in my opinion, and Charles, you're not going to like my answer, so I'm ready for the to be burned. Ask black people if they think racism has ended in America.
But that's an
Because
impossible
white people
that's
don't think it was ever a problem in the first place.
no, I think that's an impossible criteria to pin an
Dude,
endpoint
you
to.
asked me.
Yeah, but it's an impossible criteria. Racism will never
It's
end.
not. No, see, I don't agree with your. I don't think it's
It's
impossible. We're
I
using
don't think it's
statistics.
I don't think racism would ever end, right? I think that the impact of racism will definitely diminish and keeps diminishing time over time. At least the racism of today is not as pernicious as the racism of 60 years ago or 50
But
years
see,
ago,
that's a
right?
weird thing. Less pernicious doesn't mean less dangerous.
Well, also less dangerous. Yes, less dangerous as
No,
well. I'm
uh,
willing to say less dangerous.
I don't agree.
Mhm.
However, I'm going to stand by my point, and I know you kicked my butt here,
So basically, you're
but
saying that it shouldn't end. That's what you're saying, that such
no, that's
race-based
not what I'm
actions shouldn't
saying at
end.
all. If we, as Americans, and I don't just mean black Americans, but conservative Americans or whatever American you are, if we are going to live by data and trends and statistics, how about ask the community that was historically and provably discriminated against? When black people say, oh, racism isn't a problem, then that's when it all ends. I know you're not going to like that.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Stanley. Stanley, you have to work on your interruption. You're interrupting. Okay, so the next point, talking about the racial categorizations themselves used, we have Asian, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander,
You know
Hispanic,
what?
white. Stanley, let me finish my point.
Okay.
African American and Native American. It is far from evident, though, how assigning students to these racial categories and making admission decisions based on them furthers the educational benefits that the universities claim to pursue. For starters, the categories are themselves imprecise in many ways. Some of them are plainly overbroad. By grouping together all Asian students, for instance, respondents are apparently uninterested in whether South Asian or East Asian students are adequately represented, as long as there is enough of one to compensate for a lack of the other. Meanwhile, other racial categories, such as Hispanic, are arbitrary or undefined, and I totally agree with this point. I think the racial categorizations are imprecise, they are arbitrary, they are undefined, and I agree with this point 100%.
But see, that's the weird thing about American racism. If you say Black American, it's imprecise. I haven't heard anyone talk about how imprecise Black American is.
Well, Black American is imprecise because it can include American
Yes,
descendants of slaves, it can include
yes,
Africans that migrated to the US of recent, it can include the whole
absolutely.
Caribbeans, it can include, so it's still arbitrary.
But let me walk back to my point, which you seem to be avoiding. White American is imprecise. Race is imprecise. That's why it is a social construct. His Asian is imprecise. And both, well, Roberts makes a specific point to that. The way we do race in America is extremely imprecise, but we do it anyway. In this pointing out Hispanics as imprecise, I argue that saying Black American is just as imprecise because Black American can be Hispanic, correct?
Yeah, but that's the point Roberts is making, that these terms are imprecise. These
But I've
categorizations
also
are,
told you I agree with Roberts mostly.
yeah. So there's no point of contention here then.
We need to go back to history. We need to be much more precise about which part of the Black population we're talking about.
Mm.
Be more precise. I agree with that.
Yep, 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 yep. So I think most of what I highlighted to talk about with Roberts. Okay, this is an interesting one.
I would say ask or take Steve's advice. If racism is so bad, I think he's making some points that I would like to talk about.
Okay,
If
so
racism is so bad,
so what do you think? What do you think an answer to that would be? I have an answer, but what do you think, Stanley?
I'll go back to what I just said. Black in Americans, um, um, the way America conceives of race is inherently imprecise.
Hmm.
And Roberts makes that point. And I see the graph you're talking. Um, Quota, that is my quota point. They are doing quotas, and he got them cold.
I don't think that's answering Steve's question.
I think that Steve, um, if Steve says racism is so bad, why do Black Nigerians not report the same discrimination as black folk? I think that's an idiotic question. I don't know why. I'm not Nigerian black. My point is black as a racial category is imprecise. Maybe he's making my point, maybe he's not.
No, so those are two different things. And I think
No,
it's a
but see,
perfectly,
that's the problem. They're two different things, and he doesn't seem to realize that. He's really asking two different questions.
no. The point about
If
racism being
racism is so
the point
bad,
about
well,
different
ADOS
groups is
aren't
different from
Nigerian. That's the obvious point. He's
so
basically saying that if one black person sees racism and another person who's black doesn't see racism, why is there racism? And it amazes me that he doesn't see how bad a question that is. Two
okay, so
different histories would be my answer.
Stanley, let me give my answer to that. So I I may be wrong, but I think the reason why the responses to quote and unquote racism in America between African Americans and say Nigerians diaspora there, one would be as a result of the fact that the racism isn't really about skin color. It may just be about ethnicity. It may just be about you know, the fact that
So,
maybe Stanley, let me finish, please. Let me finish. It may just be about two quote and unquote ethnic groups who have issues with each other. So it's very, very possible that African Americans would be discriminated against by certain white people, why certain diaspora blacks will not receive similar treatment. This is just my theory. I'm just theorizing. It could also be that the Nigerians they might not pick up on certain cues they might not be as sensitive to certain cues as the African Americans would be because of the different cultural backgrounds and different experiences. And it might also be that the Nigerians have a tougher skin to such things and they don't see it as a bother as much as African Americans would. Given the history, that's understandable. It may also be that Nigerians are seeing, comparing it to where they're coming from and looking at the challenges they're facing back home versus the challenge of quote and unquote racism they face in the West and say, on a scale of preference, this is a nothing burger compared to the challenges I'm facing. So it may just be a whole lot of those things. It may not be because, oh, well, there is no racism. That's why the Nigerian is not seeing it. There might just be other factors in play. That's what I'm thinking.
well, I'm going to glom on two things, maybe three. Race in America is not the same thing as ethnicity. You can read a history book and figure that part out. And I'll stop there because I will only have a snide remark after that.
All right. So back to this share of admitted students by race. So I think this was a point. If you can see these percentages are like very controlled, like very strictly. The margin of error
Yes,
in this
that,
percentage is so
yeah, um,
so.
that's where Roberts gets it right.
Hmm,
Harvard is managing its percentages, which is de facto quotas. I agree with that. I agree with his
hmm,
point.
uh, hmm. So I think that may be all for all I highlighted for Robert's decision. I know that I must have skipped some points, you know, but that's possibly all I highlighted. And for me, I see the larger points that Roberts is making. and I agree to an extent. But where I take issues with is the fact that the origin of this suit in the first place, talking about, oh, Asians are being discriminated against, may just be because the pool, why it feels as if African Americans are being overrepresented, may just be because the pool from which the African Americans are even taken from is small, really very, very small compared to that of the Asians. So if you, like the example we saw earlier, it says 67 black applicants, 65 were taken. If over 1,000, up to 1,200 Asian applicants, over 1,100 was taken. But when you still look at that percentage, it seems as if the blacks were higher.
Yeah, because smaller numbers.
Yeah, smaller number. So it may just be
So I have
throwing
a
us off
huge
in
problem with this logic.
what's your problem with the logic?
Smaller numbers, we went over this. You
Smaller
don't
numbers did what?
recall? A smaller number of
Hmm.
black students applied to Harvard in the first place.
Yes.
We are working with a smaller total number.
Mm-hmm.
So, percentages, if you're going to parse a smaller number, we talked about 5 people, 3 people get accepted. That's 80%. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
And my overall point is that compared to 1,000 Asians or whatever, we're talking basically numbers don't work that way. 80% of 5 is insignificant compared to 80% of 1,000. That's
Yep.
my point.
Yep.
And it's obvious to people who actually understand. You have to think beyond the statistics. You have to understand context. I thought we covered this.
Yep. So my other issues is maybe not with this ruling, but maybe with the general points that I usually made with affirmative action, because it seems as if when affirmative action is when a black person is called to be an affirmative action hire or affirmative action student, it seems as if they were never qualified to be there in the first place. That they were just
Wait,
picked
can you say
maybe
that
because
again?
so the impression that gets thrown out when affirmative action is used in relation to black people
Right,
makes it seem as if they were never qualified to be there in the first place, that they were
right. They
picked
were
mostly
given
because of
a
their race.
special pass.
Yes, but from what I've seen, it isn't really so, at least from this judgment. It's they are picking from, okay, a pool of qualified people from different races, but race becomes an important factor in terms of, because you have a limited number of spots, race becomes an important factor in picking the
Hmm.
final um, beneficiaries of a pool of people who were qualified to be there in the first place. So it's not
Hmm.
it given that reality, it's not as pernicious as it's been made to seem, or it's not as bad as it's been made to seem. But that's just my thoughts. So tomorrow we'll be taking Justice Thomas's decision. This is for today. We did Roberts. We'll be taking Thomas's, and next tomorrow we'll just keep going on and on and on like that. If anybody else wants to call in and share their thoughts as regards this decision, these
But can
opinions, I'd appreciate that. So we just have a few more minutes to be out because it's very late and I have to go to church today. It's past it's past 12
understood.
already.
I have two things,
Okay.
and this is going to be specific to Steve. His last question, he needs to read it again and think better or ask a better question. Of course, Nigerian Americans are American, but that wasn't my point. It is surprising that he doesn't think better. And um, there's a meta point. I don't think, and Thomas actually makes a good point. In a way, Roberts has made the point to stop being a racist country. We have to stop being a racist country, and I think that is so nice.
You think that
The
is so
meta,
nice?
the met, yeah, I think it's so nice because um, he doesn't live in real America. He has not read American history and a preview of how Thomas has done it. And I have a dude, this is going to be a 2 hour show. And, in some ways, Thomas is kind of my elder. I literally knew people who knew Thomas as a kid. And he will always be my older. There will always be respect, but I just don't agree with some of the things in his decision. And the way he went after, um, I don't really, the way he went after Justice Jackson, I think was just despicable. She's a new justice.
All right, so we're going to reserve all that for tomorrow. Guys, thank you very much for coming to the show tonight. Thank you, Steve. Antonio has been here since beginning of the stream. Antonio, thank you very much. Unpopular. Fred, Anand, Stanley, thank you all for coming to the stream. I just wanted us to do it this way so that we don't miss anything important. So we're not just talking out of what we feel, what we think about the case. So it's better that we review certain points stated by the justices themselves, and then, just give our
One
thoughts on it,
last
whether
thing.
they make sense or not.
One last thing. I have to agree with Steve. He's perfectly right.
All right, guys.
But
Please like,
um,
share, and Stanley, let me
call
finish
me,
my thought.
Steve.
Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you want to support the channel, you can support us on Patreon. You can become a channel member, and you can also get my book, my crime fiction novel. You find all that in the description of this video. And so that will be all for today. It's bye for now. So I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Take it easy.
Stanley, bye.